Hi, Geoffrey. Thank you for joining us to give us a brief history of the Tour de France. And let me first properly introduce you for those in our audience who are not familiar with your work. Geoffrey Wheatcroft is a journalist and author who has been literary editor of The Spectator, London's diary editor of the Evening Standard, and a columnist for The Sunday Telegraph. His books include The Landlords, The Controversy of Zion, which won the American National Jewish Book Award, and Le Tour, A History of the Tour de France. His 2021 biography, Churchill's Shadow, was recognized by the New York Times as one of the most significant books of the year. Educated at New College, Oxford, where he studied modern history, Geoffrey's work has appeared in leading publications on both sides of the Atlantic, including The Guardian, The New York Times, The New Republic, The New York Review of Books, and The Atlantic. He lives in Bath with his wife and continues to write and lecture internationally. So thank you again, Geoffrey, for sharing this with us, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Sylvia, for inviting me. The Tour de France is one of the great French achievements of the past more than a century. Its origins are rather surprising. That is to say, there was no event, apart from two great wars, since the French Revolution 2.25 centuries ago until today, so important and consequential in French history as the Dreyfus affair. That was the great scandal of the 1890s when a Jewish army officer was falsely accused of treason and imprisoned on Devil's Island off the coast of South America until a campaign was mounted and finally succeeded in exonerating him. But the affair split France in two. On the one hand, the Dreyfusards who were supporting his case and the anti-Dreyfusards against him. And there was at the time a sports magazine called the Vélo, the French for a bike, but its policy, because it did have a political outlook, was Dreyfusard, on Captain Dreyfus's side. The rather sinister figure, the Comte de Dion, was displeased by this and started a new newspaper called the Untold, which would be anti-Dreyfusard to the extent that it did comment on politics. And in 1903, as a publicity stunt, the Untold began a new race called the Tour de France, which was going to go around the circumference of France, as its name suggested. The phrase wasn't quite new, but there was a book called Le Tour de France par deux enfants, which was enormously successful as a children's book, a school book, published 20 years earlier. Anyway, the race began, and it was unrecognizable from today's race. First of all, there were only 6 stages, and they were enormously long. The longest was from Paris to Lyon, 460 kilometers. The stages began at around 3 in the morning. The cyclists were given bottles of white brandy to see them through, and not surprisingly, more than half the field didn't make it to the end. Nevertheless, it became a success, and it caught on, partly thanks to the efforts of Henri Desgranges, who was the editor of the paper. There were 12 editions of the race before it was suddenly interrupted. By an eerie coincidence, the 12th edition began on the 30th of June, 1914, which was the date, though they may not have recognized the significance, that the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, lighting a fuse which burnt over the next month, the month that the Tour de France was being run, until only a few days after the race had ended. The whole of Europe was at war, and it left an enormous effect on France itself. When I have been covering the tour and driving through Picardy in the northeast of France, you suddenly see before you an enormous vista, which is not obvious at first what it is, but it's stone crosses, thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands upon tens of thousands of the great war cemeteries. And no fewer than three men who had won the Tour de France before 1914 were killed in the war. The Luxembourger François Fabet, Lucien Petit-Breton, and Octave Lapise. In 1919, the bike race resumed with peace, and there was an innovation. That is the dérangeait the idea of giving the leader of the race at any given point a special jersey, and the obvious color was yellow because that was the color of the paper on which his newspaper was printed. And so there was born the maillot jaune, a phrase which has entered the language. In the 1920s, the race was dominated for a time by Belgians, and in some ways, Belgium, or Flanders in the north of Belgium, is the homeland of bike racing in Europe, and it's where cyclists often go to learn their trade. The race was still, to some extent, overshadowed by politics, and it, of course, came to an end in 1939. There was no running of the race in 1940 until 1947. When it resumed, there was another echo of politics because the paper, the Auto, had been published under the Vichy regime. It was effectively collaborationist, and so it was brought to a halt, although actually it was renamed rather than closed forever. The same thing happened, by the way, with the famous French newspaper Le Temps, which emerged as Le Monde after the war. And the Auto now emerged as L'Équipe, which it has been ever since. And the Amore family were also granted an effective ownership of the race because they had been on the right side during the war. They had been resistants. There were a number of heroic duels for which the race became more and more known between two Italian cyclists, between Battagli, who incidentally had a good record under the occupation in Italy, or rather under the Mussolini regime, and Fausto Coppi, the Campionissimo, who was perhaps the most famous cyclist there had been until then, when he won the Tour in 1952. Since then, there have been long periods when the race has been dominated by a single cyclist. There was Jacques Anquetil in the early 1960s, who duelled year by year with Raymond Poulidor. And Poulidor was a rather poignant figure because although he was a very fine cyclist, he was the permanent second. He never managed to win the race. I remember seeing him as we were going up the Galibier. He was working for Crédit Lyonnais, one of the sponsors of the race, and I caught sight of his rather melancholy face. He's no longer with us. This was 25 years ago. Then the race was dominated in the early 70s by Eddy Merckx. It has to be said that the French people haven't always shown the purest sporting spirit that they set upon the Italian cyclists in the 1950 running of the race. And in 1975, someone leapt out of the crowd and punched Eddy Merckx in the kidneys. One of the things that this is, you might think it almost too tempting, but to have the spectators in close proximity to the cyclists, but it's one of the things that makes the Tour so exciting. You can see on television that when they go up on the great climbs in the Alps or the Pyrenees, the crowd on either side hem in the cyclists, and just occasionally they do get tangled up, or some idiot jumps out in front of the cyclists, as happened 2 days ago, or holds up a placard which knocks someone over. The race is, of course, very dangerous. I mean, it is. No day passes without a crash, and the cyclists are very tough because they are used to taking heavy falls and getting back up again, as happened only the other day. One huge crash, and Pogacar, who's leading the race as I speak, came down and hurt himself badly, but got up again and started. When you go over the mountain passes in the Pyrenees and Alps, you sometimes see the memorials. Go over the Col de Galibier in the Alps, and you see the Stèle des Granges, and there is another in the Pyrenees, and one very poignant monument, a little rather well-designed monument on the Col de Porte d'Aspet in the Pyrenees, which is the Stèle Casatelli, the monument to Fabio Casatelli, a very fine Italian cyclist, who had just crested the climb in 1995 and was freewheeling downhill when he lost control of his bike and went head over heels and was killed. When you see the race, actually, you might wonder why there haven't been more serious accidents, because it is simply hair-raising and an immense contest. The Tour has developed its own literature. It was covered for many years by Antoine Blondin, a very interesting French novelist who would write daily reports for the Keep. There was a popular culture. There were many songs about the Tour. I shall not sing "Je suis allé les voir, les Tours de France," but it's a jolly song. And I suppose the most intellectually distinguished writer about the Tour was Roland Barthes, who wrote a most amusing series. He was one of the leading French intellectuals of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and he wrote a series of short essays called Mythologie, or Mythologies, which, as it were, deconstructed various aspects of everyday life, or rather his rather curious choice of them, from wine drinking to striptease. But one of them was on the Tour de France, and it's called the Tour de France comme épopée, the Tour de France as an epic. And it is indeed highly amusing, because he sees the cyclists in terms of the heroes of the Iliad, of Hector and Lysander fighting each other. The Tour was won in 1985 by Bernard Hinault, who had already won it several times. But that was, I have to say, the last time a French rider has won it, 40 years ago, rather like Wimbledon, which has almost never been won by an English tennis player, though it's our great creation. There were Irish winners like Stephen Roche. There were Americans, beginning with Greg LeMond. Then it was dominated in the 1990s by the Spanish riders. Then, alas, we have to come to the more somber side of the story. In 1998, the race began on a dramatic. Actually, began in Ireland. Although it's the French race, it has begun in Denmark. It has begun in the Netherlands. It's begun in England, and very successful it was. But the team bus of Festina was crossing the Belgian frontier into France when it was stopped for no particular reason, and the officials found a mobile pharmacy of drugs, which that team, and indeed most teams, were using at the time. The fact is that throughout its existence, the Tour de France has been susceptible to various forms of stimulant. As I say, alcohol before the Great War. Between the wars, cocaine, which the cyclists took quite openly. After the war, after 1945, what the Italians called la bomba, the amphetamines. And then there came 35 years ago, the early 90s, the very dark story of the drug called erythropoietin, which, not surprisingly, is known for short as EPO. And unlike any other drug used previously, it actually did enhance performance because it enhanced the red blood cells. And because it was a synthetic version of a human metabolism, it was extremely difficult to detect. And indeed, it wasn't detected for many years. And the person whose name will always be associated with it is Lance Armstrong, who seemed in the late 90s and then for several years after the turn of the millennium to be one of the greatest cyclists there had ever been. But he came under more and more suspicion until he finally confessed, and his name has been struck off the list of cyclists. And I believe, I hope not too naively, that the race is clean again today. We now have one of the greatest cyclists there have ever been, Tadej Pogacar, the Slovene, very young Slovene. He's already won the race 3 times, and he, as I speak, is completely dominant, several minutes ahead of his rivals. Today, the race is going to go over a route which has an exhilarating aspect, but at the same time, a very unhappy memory, because they're going to climb Mont Ventoux. They go over enormously high passes in the Pyrenees and the Alps, 3,000 meters, 2,500. The Mont Ventoux isn't like that. The Pyrenees and Alps are 2 enormous mountain ranges, but Mont Ventoux has to be seen. It is a most wonderful and awe-inspiring sight. A great peak which suddenly rises up from the middle of the plain in northern Provence. And it's exhausting enough to drive to the top, let alone to ride to the top. Halfway up, there is a kind of shrine, because in 1967, England had produced, really for the first time, a great cyclist, Tom Simpson, who never won the Tour de France, but was a serious competitor. Alas, his attitude towards stimulants was summed up by his saying, if it takes 10 to kill you, I'll have 9, which ceased to be funny one day in 1967, halfway up Mont Ventoux, when he keeled over and was rushed to hospital by helicopter, but died on the way. And he had been taking quantities of amphetamines. That was 30 years before the 1998 Tour de Farce, the idiotic scandal, the Festina affair. And as I say, everything has now been done because finally the testers have caught up with the dopers, and a way of discovering EPO was of finding it in the system was at last found. Although there are other more alarming forms of doping, like blood doping, when a cyclist is given an injection of fresh blood, his own or someone else's. I think, as I've just said, that the race is cleaner today. And although Pogacar's astonishing dominance might lead to eyebrows being raised, there is every reason to think that the race is now clean, and it is going through a very exhilarating phase. And we have a great champion. We have some very fine cyclists competing against him, but at the moment it doesn't look as though anyone is going to catch him. At any rate, I'm looking forward to today's stage and looking forward to the conclusion of the race. First of all, they will go over the Alps and over the Col de Galibier, and then we will crown Pogacar with his yellow jersey, and indeed he may well have another jersey besides. On top of the yellow jersey, they introduced what sometimes in English is called the polka dot jersey for the champion climber, the person who is best over the great mountain climbs. I prefer the French phrase, the maillot à pois, the red peas jersey. Then there is a jersey for the best young cyclist, which is white, and there is the green jersey for the best sprinter. And we can at least claim, even if no English cyclist is a serious competitor this year, England produced the greatest, as the Equipe itself has said, the greatest sprinter of all time, Sir Mark Cavendish, who equaled Eddy Merckx's record of 34 stage wins 7 years ago, and then last year surpassed it. And it was a wonderful day. Christian Prudhomme, who is the director of the race, and a most engaging man, said that everyone here is wearing a big smile. And Cavendish was congratulated by every member of the peloton, the entire field. And so, even if at the moment it's not any more competitive than when it was dominated by Eddy Merckx, it remains a tremendous race, and I think wins its way one of the great French achievements. And every year it comes around, I think again, vive la France, vive le Tour de France.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes, I think we had an image of Pogacar in one of the photos, and we had a few images of the ambiance, like I was saying. It really grips the whole country, doesn't it?
It does. It does.
I have a couple of questions that have came in from the audience before. So I think you touched on it already, what happened during the Nazi occupation.
Well, of course, there was no bike racing at all. There was no race in 1940, which was, it would have coincided with the Pétain signing the armistice, and there was no race.
No race at all, not even a
there was
token.
No token at all. People were still riding bicycles, but the Tour de France was suspended and didn't, in fact, start until 1947 after the war.
So it took a while. And these are the last two questions are mostly your opinion. Is how has the Tour de France influenced the popularity of cycling?
Well, it's influenced it hugely. I mean, when Armstrong was winning it every year, or supposedly winning it, there was a great upsurge in cycling in America, and cycling is a very popular sport. It always puzzles me that newspapers don't give more coverage. In English newspapers, the Equipe, of course, covers it magnificently every year, but it's one of the most popular activities, and bike racing itself is very popular. And the Tour de France has had successes in the form of the Giro d'Italia in May each year, as opposed to, and then the Tour in July, and then after that the Vuelta, which is the Spanish equivalent, and they're all wonderful spectacles. It's well worth if you ever get the opportunity of being somewhere where the Tour de France is going through a village, because the villages will be en fête, and everyone will be having a picnic and waiting for Of course, they only see it for about 90 seconds as the cyclists come through.
Yes, I thought there's a lot of waiting, and then zoom.
but it is still very good fun. And
yes,
there are thousands of people who go to the summits and with their camper vans and wait to watch the cyclists coming up agonizingly slowly.
Yes, it is great fun. Yeah, the atmosphere is amazing. And sorry, go ahead.
I should just say one thing I ought to have mentioned was that Desgrange was in the first decades of the race conservative to the point of being obscurantist, and he first of all insisted that until 1930, I believe, that cyclists who needed to repair their bikes should do it themselves, and he also tried to stop collaborative racing, that is to say, a team where one where the domestique, those who are working for the team leader, will ride with him and sometimes perform humble tasks like fetching water for him. But as it has turned out, it is an individual team sport, and the strong teams provide a great advantage to their leader. Although, of course, the very best leaders don't need are really individualists on their own.
Yes. And this year we're building up to the Grand Arrivée on Sunday. Is it in Paris?
Yes, yes, we are, and that is also huge fun.
Quite a show.
Although
And yeah, yes, and it's super crowded when they arrive. And the last question is, you touched on it also already, but your opinion, among the many champions and controversies, which moment do you feel had the most profound impact on the race's legacy?
well, I think it was probably when Fausto Coppi in 1952 did what nobody does today. That is to say, he went off on a huge breakaway on his own. You will see the day by day that a cyclist, one cyclist, or a group of cyclists will escape. They will get away from the peloton, the main field, and very occasionally one of the escapers or breakaways will win that day's stage. It has happened this year. More often, the peloton will catch them, rather like a pack of hounds catching a fox. But what is rarer and rarer is for the individual cyclists, and indeed, there's a reason why they're hesitant in escaping on their own. Because of the memory of Bernard Hinault in 1986, when he was leading the race quite easily, but then wore himself out attacking. And on the whole, they haven't done so. That hasn't happened very often since. But when it does happen, it is a wonderful sight, and also, of course, the sight of two riders side by side, as we saw 2 days ago, when one cyclist actually won the stage in the Pyrenees, but behind him were Vingegaard, the Danish cyclist who looked as though he was going to win the stage. Unfortunately, he was riding side by side, coude à coude, with Pogačar, who simply went for it and left him behind. And watching a moment like that is unforgettable.
So today is the difference mostly on the rider or their equipment, do you think?
Well, of course, since those very primitive bikes I've described in the early years of the 20th century, they would be rather like, what we call a push bike today, the kind of thing
yes.
you ride around town in. But they have become more and more sophisticated. And a racing bike is now extremely expensive. It costs much more than quite an expensive car. And they have yet another thing that Lagrange tried to stop was gears. And in the early days of the race, if they were going up a mountain pass, the cyclists had to remove a wheel and turn it round. But then the gears have become more and more sophisticated until they are extremely, not complicated, but they can't be too complicated because, of course, as you will sometimes see, the chain will come off the ring and the rider has to stop. Or occasionally, his team car will. It's a rather wonderful sight for agility, because when the cyclist has got a mechanical and something has gone wrong with the bike, maybe with the chain coming free, his team car will draw level with him and someone will lean out and fix the bike while he's riding it.
Amazing.
And my own cycling days are long gone, I should say. I mean, I have got what I've just called a push bike, and I use that for shopping. But I am now, as I am, I'm afraid, with most sports, a very happy armchair participant.
And we will all be following for the rest of the week. Thank you so much, Geoffrey. For everyone who would like to read the book or follow Geoffrey's work, you have the website address on the screen. And thank you again so much, Geoffrey, for bringing us this little Tour de France today.
Well, thank you very much for asking me. Very
Thank
good.
you.
Bye now.